This last couple weeks, I've been reading a book by A.W. Tozer, The Pursuit of God. Have any of you read it? Oh, it's a classic. If you've ever read, I highly recommend reading A.W. Tozer. But it's one of those books that you should sit. Any of his works, he writes in such a way that it's best to be like taken a little bit at a time and to kind of meditate on it, because it's a lot of it's real deep. And just really powerful if you just let it sit and kind of breathe a little bit. But as I was reading this book, The Pursuit of God, it was funny. It's funny how certain texts, they can be written a long time ago, and you're wow, it still feels very fresh and modern. And this book was written in 1948, and he has in this, he's kind of talking about the pursuit of things and possessions, and the kind of the problems that possessions face in our life. And he saw that in the human heart, we generally have a problem with our items, with our possessions. And he observed this. This is good. There is within the human heart a tough and fibrous root of fallen life, whose nature it is to possess and to always possess. It covets things with a deep and fierce passion. The pronouns of my and mine look innocent enough in print, but their constant and universal use is significant. And I was boy. And it's funny because right now, Wendell, he's about 1.5, almost 2. Well, I guess he's almost 2 in April, so I guess he's more than 1.5. But he's discovered the words mine, and it's just it's so telling, and how him and his siblings, they fight about things that are mine, no, mine. It reminds me also of that scene of Finding Nemo when the seagulls are all fighting for things. And we all laugh at it, but there is a truth to this underlying it in our human heart that it starts innocently enough that this desire or this passion for things, and it's not even a bad thing. Who does anybody have a collection of sorts? I know that we all probably some people collect stamps. I don't collect that, but I collect books. I have way too many books in my house, but I'm sure that all of us, not all of us, but a lot of us have collections of things. Maybe it might be a tool collection. Maybe it might be a wood collection. Maybe you're things like woodworking. Maybe it's a yarn collection. If you're a knitter, you have your stash. Maybe you love collecting handbags. I recently discovered that Heather, she likes to collect bags. She's she's always looking for a new bag. Not that she buys them, but she has a bag problem actually. I have a book problem. I also have a yarn problem. But and I think what starts innocently enough with our small little collections of maybe coffee cups or tools can start innocently enough, but then it can start over time to become a tyranny of sorts, a tyranny of things. We wake up one morning and we're just oh man, I have just a lot of crap in my house. And sometimes we see this in the extreme, right? If you've ever known a hoarder, this is the extreme end of this, right? Where people literally become endangered by their things, right? Because they can't move around, because of their inability to let things go. Maybe you've seen the show Hoarders on TLC, or maybe you've known a hoarder. And I think this is and it's a real thing. I know that that night, I'm not trying to knock character. It's it's a struggle. It's a real struggle to let things go, and it's also a very big challenge. I know that I've had to I have loved ones who struggled with this, but really I think we're all kind of on a spectrum really of hoarding, if we're really honest with ourselves. And I think that there's a more socially acceptable form of the tyranny of things that we kind of that we all just kind of agree with is fine. And I think it's manifested in things like consumer debt. We like to buy things that we can't really afford, and it's often just honestly stupid stuff, stupid crap that we don't need. And then we get stuck on payment plans with high interests that eventually that could cascade if we're not like fiscally responsible, can end up feeling oppressive. If you've ever had to deal with like a large amount of consumer debt, like that, it's like a real struggle. It's real and it's awful. And if you've ever taken any time to like listen to like Dave Ramsey's talk show or like in kind of hear people's stories around debt, it's really sad. And like I've struggled with consumer debt. So I'm not pointing a finger at anybody here, because like I've known the struggle it is to get back from under that, right? It's hard. We all have the impulse to collect and to buy, and we all derive pleasure from owning things, right? There's a reason why like America, like the American dream is synonymous with home ownership, right? Like we all want to own things. We all want to possess things. And you know what? This goes way, way back, people. This goes way back. And I love how A.W. Tozer really connects this with our fallen life. Because really goes back to the first ancestral act of possession. If you go to the very beginning pages of the Bible in Genesis chapter 3, what's interesting here in this story, and I think this is on purpose here, and I think this is a deep spiritual, I think there's like some deep wisdom here. The first act of possession, do you know what it was? It was taking from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because it says that, Eve looks at it, saw it was desirable, and she took it, right? It's the first act of possessing something for ourselves, to possess wisdom on our own terms, something that wasn't really ours to begin with. And what is interesting in this moment, what we see is something new happens in the Bible. We see a new relationship form between God, right? Like up until that point, our relationship with God was different, as also with things, right? That when we take from the knowledge of good and evil, it didn't only shape our relationship with God, it shaped our relationship with our stuff. I think this is really important to get at. And now we are suffering under our possessions rather than being blessed by the gifts that God gave us in his good world, right? God created this world, and then we decided to take something apart from God, and now we're struggling under the oppression of our things. When Jesus came, he preached the kingdom and its upside down countercultural vision of generosity. And it was to heal our hearts and to free our souls and to give us joy, right? This is what we've been talking about. If you haven't been here, this is your first week, or you haven't been here for a while, we're in a series about the joy of giving and the spiritual practice of generosity and how it can help shape us in our discipleship to Jesus. And I think here is an important thing. I think Jesus wants us to redeem our relationship with our stuff. That's a part of the Christian journey, is a redeeming relationship with our things, and to put it into a correct order. So if you've been here the last few weeks, we've looked at a few things. We've looked at Jesus, and we've been looking at different statements that Jesus make about money and possessions. First, we talked about that there was more joy in giving than receiving. And we've also talked about that there is to watch out for greed, right? That greed's all around us and that we should watch out for it. So this week, we are looking kind of at the third mind shift Jesus wants to have for us, and it's this. This is what Jesus wanted us to know, is that all that there is, all of creation, all of it ultimately belongs to God, right? We don't really own anything. That's the lie that we've been fed, is that we are the owners of things when we're not really the owners of things. If we want to experience the freedom of the gospel, we need to learn this truth, that everything belongs ultimately to God. All that there is, all of my stuff, really doesn't belong to me. And I am not its master. God is. And I'm merely a caretaker. And when we can make that shift, I call this the stewardship mind set. Man, that was like a lot of so many vowels and so many consonants. It's like marbles in my mouth this morning. It really frees us to be more generous people. When we can make the shift, I think it will allow us to let go a little bit, to relax a little bit, to find more joy in the world, and not be so tight-fisted with our things. And that really, when we let that go, we can then actually master our stuff rather than being mastered by it. And all of this is kind of like all of this mindset of stewardship is, I think, at the heart of one of Jesus' most misunderstood statements around things. Multiple times in the Gospels, Jesus commands various people to sell their possessions, right? We have the rich young ruler and other places. We also have it show up in Luke chapter 12, 33. And it's interesting, this passage, Jesus, so it's, we kind of hinted at it in Bible study. If you were at Bible study, we talked about don't be anxious about tomorrow. And in that section in Luke, it's very similar to what's happening in Matthew 6, but he ends it with, go and sell your possessions and give to the poor. So what are we to make of that? Like, I don't know. Those sorts of statements by Jesus make me really uncomfortable, right? I'm just going to kind of ignore that, Jesus. I'm not going to sell my possessions and give them to the poor. That just feels, nope, not for me, Jesus. So what are we supposed to do with this statement? Does it mean that we actually, all of us, need to go through our houses and sell everything and live in communes, like in the book of Acts? And I say this in all seriousness, because there are some groups who actually do that, right? There's certain radical Christian movements, there are Anabaptist groups like the Bruderhof. There are also monastic communities that do this, right? If you think in the more Catholic sense. So are we all supposed to become monks? Are we supposed to take Jesus literally here? What's going on, Jesus? What are you trying to say here? Are we all just failing at our discipleship because we own things? Or should we just, set up South Salem Friends commune? Well, I think we can learn from the prophetic witness of these groups that don't own anything. I think that there is something, I've noticed that there's something deeply, I can deeply respect people who do that. But I think it's really actually not very reproducible for most of us. I know that it's kind of hard to live in a commune with children. That's why I think that, a lot of monks and nuns are celibate. And I, seriously, not all, I think that there, and if you even look at the history of Christian communes in generally, a lot of them don't last for very long. So I think that there's something that it's very unnatural. So what is Jesus getting at here? I don't think that he's meaning that all of us need to go and join these groups. I think what Jesus is getting at here isn't so much of Jesus hates material possessions and we shouldn't own them. I think he's really trying to get at our heart around our possessions. Material possessions, taking care of things, owning things in some regard, isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of themselves. So I don't think that Jesus is calling all of us to become radical ascetics, but rather I think he's taking aim at the attachment that we have to the things that we own, right? Because I think that can and does us harm in a lot of ways. Rather, I think Jesus is committed to radical generosity and calling us to a different kind of life through the giving away of our things and selling our possessions, giving of our money. We can kind of start moving as we kind of practice this. Maybe not sell everything, but sell maybe some things. We can begin to move away from the lie of ownership to the freedom of stewardship. Stewardship, when we take this as a mindset, is really actually freeing. So if we kind of Jesus make the statement in Luke 12, sell your possessions. If you look in the context of that verse, it's in this whole series of, it's sandwiched between two parables about money and ownership. And then right above it is do not be worried about things today and seek first the kingdom. Like that's kind of the context. And if we look at what Jesus' statements about, selling your possessions, I think it really is clarified here. In the first parable that he tells is the parable of the rich fool who has so much stuff that he has to build bigger barns and then suddenly dies unhappy to enjoy his wealth, right? So this is kind of like, you're like, that's silly. You just build all these bigger barns and you weren't able to use them. And then underneath the verse, we have Jesus' parable of the vigilant servant who carefully tends to his master's good and then is rewarded for it. And what you do is, what you kind of get to see is that there's this, you have the first story, which is negative, and it's really about the evils of hoarding. And the later one that's positive about a wise servant who is a caretaker, right? You have one person who is fixated with ownership and owning lots of things and finding his security in that. And then, so he makes barns to store and make secure. And then you have somebody who is not owning anything, but rather taking care of something, and he's rewarded. And I think that that's important when we're trying to understand what Jesus is trying to say about selling our things. And I think in all, I think the context is driving us, is that Jesus is making an intense rhetorical statement about selling our possessions to make this so that we can reconsider our attachment to our things. And I think that Jesus is using the parable of the wise servant to clarify his earlier statement. So I just want to briefly look at the parable of the wise servant. Here, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and the disciples of Jesus are being likened to the servants of a wealthy aristocrat, waiting into being ready. And here's the twist. In verse 37, he says, "Truly I tell you, he will dress himself to serve, and then will recline with them at the table, and will come and wait on him." This is referring to the aristocrat. And this is kind of like an upside down thing, right? The servant who is managing his master's household well, when his master comes in, the master's going to then kind of reverse the roles and then going to serve the servant. This is a parable of the kingdom, of what is it going to be like in the kingdom. This is Jesus' picture of God. God is a rich, generous master who takes the place of a servant to his servants. However, the disciples are kind of confused like this, most of the time, and I don't blame them. Jesus' parables sometimes can be a riddle, and you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, Jesus. So he goes on in 42 to kind of further explain this. As the Lord answered, "Then who is faithful? Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food and allowance in the proper time? It will be good for the servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will be put in charge of all of his possessions." Meaning, if he does a good job stewarding his master's house, the master will give him even more resources to steward. But suppose the servant says to himself, "My master is taking a long time in coming," and then begins to beat the other servants, both men and women, and eat and drink and get drunk, and he begins to waste the master's resources in treating people under his care terribly. The master of that servant will come on a day when he will not expect him, and in an hour that he is not aware, and cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. Ooh, wow, that cranked that up to 11. And then here's the summary line. "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." This kind of sums up, I think, Jesus' view on wealth. Wealth isn't something that we are given for ourselves, right? When God gives us, riches in this life, possessions in this life, it's not because, they're just for us to consume, but God wants us to steward them. He wants us to steward them. In other words, we are called, this is our calling, to be active and responsible managers of God's creation for God's purposes. The wealth of this world is really God inviting us to be his account managers. not ours. The idea, and this idea of stewardship is like all through the Bible. I want to give you some kind of a brief overview here of just kind of like what we see in the Bible, kind of a biblical theology of stewardship of sorts. First, God is the creator of everything, so he owns it all. Verse story in the Bible, God creates the heavens and the earth. Another way of saying this is he created everything, and everything belongs to him. The universe is his creation. And then he creates a garden, and literally, and then he creates animals and like all these things. But what's interesting here is all of these things become a gift. People don't buy it. And then he puts Adam and Eve, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. So we see, God is the creator of things, but then we also see in, this show up in other places. Like in the Torah, God commands the people not to sell and buy land. He says, the land must not be sold permanently because the land is mine, and you reside in the land as foreigners and strangers. To the Lord belongs the heavens, even the highest heavens, and the earth and everything in it. For every animal in the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills is mine. See, here are just like a handful of verses to kind of get this impression that God is ultimately the owner of everything. But not only that, we're also, this is the next key point, that we're entrusted by God to use his resources for good. God owns it all, but he entrusts it to you and me to steward it. So let's go back to the Garden of Eden, where, after he creates Adam and Eve, what does he do? He tells them to work and take care of the garden, right? Not to own it, but to serve it, right? And this, too, is kind of like a theme that's woven throughout Scripture. And we clearly see this in, Jesus' like parable of the talents, right? That, God as a master gives talents to his servants so that they can do good with them and invest them, to grow them, and not to hide or hoard them. Now, we don't live in and I think what's hard when you think about like gardens and in a lot of Jesus's, statements, he kind of couches them in agrarian economics. So I think a better way of thinking of it is that we're like finance, right? So if Jesus was here, we are basically his asset managers. Think of people who work in finance for their job and invest other people's money. They make their living off of good stewardship. If a rich person gives them $1 million to invest and they grow it by, $100,000 through their skill and diligence, they usually just draw a fee of like 1% of their total assets around, 11,000. Woohoo! Right? It's a win-win for everybody. The guy who invested his money gets a win. The asset manager gets a win. But if they're a bad manager, say they take that $100K and they spend it all on a house for themselves or go on vacation in the Bahamas, we would probably call the cops, revoke their license, they would go to prison, and we wouldn't entrust them with resources anymore. God entrusts us as his image bearers to invest in his assets in the world, right? And then finally, we see this. God blesses us to give more, not just to have more, right? We see this all throughout Jesus' parables on stewardship. The steward of them who stewards his master's resources well is given more resources to steward. Increases in wealth are meant to be, and this is key, increases in generosity, not for us to lord it over people, not to live in luxury. No one does a better job of working out this principle than I think Paul in this second letter of Corinthians, when he is working on talking about generosity. And specifically, he's working on raising money for missions. And he says, God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, and you will abound in every good work, as it is written, they have freely scattered their gifts to the poor, and the righteous endure forever. Now he who supplies the seed to the sower and bread for food will also supply an increase of your store of seed and will enlarge your house for the harvest of righteousness. You will be enriched in every way so that you may, and this is You'll be enriched in every way so that you can be generous on every occasion, and that through us, your generosity will result in the thanksgiving to God, right? Paul understood that wealth is not for our own purposes, but for God's purposes. It's to make us more generous, not more luxurious. Thus, the purpose of wealth is not to make us rich, but to make us more generous and to experience God's joy in his generosity, not to build bigger barns, but to steward more of God's resources to the right place. As James Merritt put it, God blesses us to raise our standard of giving, not our standard of living. I wish I came up with that, but that was like, that's such a good one, right? Like, how many of us, when we get a raise or a bump in a paycheck, we're like, oh, I'm gonna buy nicer things for myself. Maybe if we took a time and be like, maybe this is God inviting me to be more generous to people. And I think that this is a beginning of this. I think this is a conversion of sorts, right? It's not. I think this takes time. So how can we start to realize the shift in this mindset, right? How can we kind of shift in this direction? How can we start to try to become? How can we try to adopt a more stewardship mindset? Because like anything, we kind of have to like practice it. It's not going to come naturally. So what spiritual practice can we do to help us kind of make the shift in our hearts and our souls away from the tyranny of things to stewardship? And I would suggest, and this is going to be, I know that I'm going to say the T word here, and I'm sure I'm probably going to lose some people. Tithing. He's going to start talking about tithing in church. Oh, and like, I get it. It makes me uncomfortable. I've been here for years, and this is, I think, the first time I've talked about tithing. So, it's uncomfortable, and I understand it because people get cagey around churches asking for money, right? But I think it's a good opportunity to practice this stewardship mindset of giving back to God his thanks, right? Now, I'm going to give a chunk of my income that I've earned or has been given, and I'm going to give it back to God. I'm going to try doing that. Tithing is a practice of giving back to God what God gave in the first place, right? And I think ultimately, its point is it's to reorient our hearts. It's to reorient our hearts. And I think that this is why in many church traditions, tithing is a very central practice. I know that some church traditions, like, if you don't do this, you're sinning. And then other church traditions is like, we speak freedom to you. You don't have to give it all. So it's like, I know that we all probably come with some baggage and with this. But I think at the heart of it, really, it is a faith issue. And I think it is really a practice of our relationship to God. And I get it. I have struggled with tithing in my life. I am for years, I was the worst tither. I think that's also because, one, I have lots of excuses. So maybe this is not great. But I know for me, I don't carry a checkbook around normally. And I usually pay with things with debit cards. I'm not scanning them, and I don't normally have cash on hand when I come to church. So you literally don't usually have cash in my pocket. But that's just an excuse, right? I do own checks, and I can pay rent. So there's that. But I think that the point that I'm trying to get at is I do think that underneath my excuses, there was a real struggle with feeling letting go of that money, being I was worried about the future. I was worried about the what ifs. I was worried about these things. I was worried about my standard of living, and I didn't want to give it away, right? If I'm going to be radically honest, I was I'm not going to be generous, God. I need this because what if you don't take care of me? Yeah. And I think so when we tithe, it's not just when you give to church, it's not just, I think why it's so touchy for a lot of us because it really is an act of faith. It is really an act of being like, I'm going to give this money to you, God, and I'm going to trust you with it. And I think ultimately it reworks our heart to trust God. Now the word tithe comes from, this is where it gets cagey here. It means 10%, right? It's a tenth of something. And I think it's easy to think that, we can get in the trap though. And I think there's the people who struggle with tithing in general, and I am your people. Like I struggle with that myself. I wrestle with God with generosity. So so there's that people. Then I think that there's the next person, right? So I'm gonna move over to this next group of people. Maybe you grew up with tithing. This is what you do. This is what you practice. This is easy for you. I think that there is a temptation then to say, my income, 10% is God's, totally. But that 90%, that's all mine. I can do whatever I want with it. As long as I give 10% to God, 90%'s mine. And I want to push back on that a little bit, because everything we have actually belongs to God. And we are entrusted to use 100% of it well. But I think that the practice of tithing moves us in the right direction. It moves us in the right direction. But then it raises all sorts of questions because and this is, I'm going to give you a dirty little secret about the New Testament. Nowhere does it command us to give 10%. Nowhere does it command us to give 10%. The whole 10% thing comes from the Old Testament. So we are to ask the question, how much are we to give then? And Christians, our task is with discerning, how much do I give? What do I keep? What do I give? What's an appropriate standard of living? Where's the line between enjoying our life and sacrificing for God? Where is the line of, are we going to be wasting his resources? What kind of car should I drive so that I can give? How many pairs of shoes should I own? How many travel bags do you need, right? Like, we can kind of go on an infinite question of like all of these things. And I say these things because, do I buy like the free range organic eggs, or do I get the conventional eggs? Do I buy, is it okay if I buy, the not ethically sourced clothing? Or should I spend more and raise my standard of living, even though it costs more, but I know that slavery wasn't used? We can kind of go into all these questions about how do we use your money, and it can be extremely overwhelming. However, we can get lost in the weeds. So I'm not saying that we just start somewhere. Just start somewhere. And I think here are some basics here. Some basics. First is this. And I get these all from Paul in his letters. And I think here's, and I'm going to give us some guidelines for discernment here. One, we should make it a practice to be regular givers and not sporadic. It says in 1 Corinthians 16:12, he says, on the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money, and the sum of money is given to the church. But back then, it's kind of hard for us to imagine. Sometimes people would bring in their goats or their grain because they didn't really have a lot of liquid cash on hand. But you should make it a practice to do something regular, and it might not be every week. I know for me, a habit I've done is I have started to do something monthly, because that's how we run our funds in our house. That it's just easier to write one check at the beginning of the month than or at the end of the month than to do it every week. But if you're struggling to even doing that, maybe doing it every week, being I'm going to take that money out and I'm going to set it aside. Go for it. This is another key point. It's proportional. 2 Corinthians 8:3. Each of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income. Meaning, if you make more money, you can give a greater percentage of what you give. However, if you're barely able to afford just the basic necessities of life, even though you're still called to live generously, it's going to look very different. So it's like, so don't feel like, because I know that if you're on a fixed income and you only have so much money, and electric bill is higher, eggs are higher, gas is higher, and you're like, I literally can't give 10%, or I'm going to be in debt. You don't have to give 10%. Just like I do want to give you that freedom. So think about where you're at. And I think that's where we can get legalistic with the number 10. But you should ask yourself, I think there's a lot of us that aren't in that camp, that we could probably, and this is the other thing, we could give more than 10%, but we choose not to. But I think the basic principle is the more that you make, the more that you should give. As your wealth increases, your generosity should increase in wealth. I have a friend who, one of my good friends, his thing is that every year he's trying to increase his generosity. So so when he started, he's really into Dave Ramsey. He got out of debt, and then every year, him and his wife try to make it so that they can increase their percentage of giving up into. So they first started at 10, and I think now they're at 25% of their income. And it's just I was like, wow, okay. But then they make choices to say no to certain things. But what's interesting is his income has increased over the years, and now is making a lot more money. But he's giving more than he's ever been able to give before. And so it's think about that. Find where you can give. Make it a proportion. And I think this is another thing. It should be, on some level, a little bit sacrificial. 2 Corinthians 9:7. They gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. Meaning, I think it should hurt a little bit. I think that if you can give 10% and you don't, and you're just like, oh, that's totally fine for me, I could probably actually give more. Maybe you should. Granted, if you can't because you literally don't have the money, maybe 1% is a sacrifice to you. That's okay. That's totally okay. Don't feel like this is shaming you, because that's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to find is find where you can discern where that might be. If you've never tithed regularly, giving even 1%, do it. Start 1, 2, 3, 5. You can grow into this. But I think that this is a key point. There should be regular times where we want to buy things and we can't because we are trying to give. I think that is a general principle. Maybe you have to say no to yourself on some regard so that you can be generous to others. And I think that is a transforming experience. And that might not even be money. Maybe you don't have money. Maybe you can give of your food. Maybe you can give of your time, right? There are different ways of doing this. 4, it should be voluntary. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, right? This should not, you should give what you can give, and it should come from a joyful heart. But sometimes, I do have to say, it doesn't feel joyful, right? You'd be like, okay, I'm going to give, it's going to be voluntary, but man, I don't like doing this. So so you don't have to feel spiritually inauthentic, because I think this is the struggle with spiritual practices in general. Sometimes we feel like we need to feel like it has to be perfect before we do the thing. And sometimes I think the way it works is we do the thing and then we feel it later, and then we do it again and again and again, and then we build up a practice so that when we give, it's great. It's like going to the gym. At first, it's no fun. You're like, this is awful. 6 months in, you're like, and you do it consistently, you're like, I can't wait for it. That was me. I love going to the gym now. I used to hate it. I used to fear the gym. I used to have serious gym phobia. But after you do it for a while, you start to be transformed. Same thing. Sometimes you have to push past your feelings a little bit, say no to that inner voice, but it should be voluntary. So that's what, and then, joyful. God loves a cheerful giver. God doesn't want grumpy money. I think that's, he's not trying to pry your pennies out of your hand, Ebenezer Scrooge. But I think that there is a wrestle there. So I don't want to, if you don't feel super joyful at the moment, that's okay. That's okay. Work on it. But if you're just like, I'm only going to do this because the pastor told me so, maybe work on your heart. Pray a bit. And I think this is I'm going to cap this all off. Giving should be motivated because of our discipleship to Jesus, not because you feel like it is just a religious duty or that you feel like you're going to get something out of it, right? I think that there is a strain in prosperity gospel, and I think this is a kind of a half-truth. It's a half-truth, right? When we become more generous, I have seen this in my own life, God tends to bless you. However, it's not really the way if you're going to do it so that you can get things out of it, like God's a vending machine, so you're like, well, I'm going to be generous so that God can give me all sorts of things, like a commercial jet. Wait to be disappointed, because that's not really how God works. If that's your heart, I'm sorry. It's not like some sort of like you punch in this formula and God's going to bless you with things. It's not how it works. Growing in our generosity, giving, is an aspect of being trained under Jesus for kingdom living. So, like, the end of itself it should be Jesus, ultimately, in his kingdom, not about what I can get from it or feeling this, like, obligation. And sometimes those things can be helpful in, like, the short term, but, and all of us come with mixed emotions with this, right? Sometimes you feel, like, you might feel guilty from not giving, and you're like, well, I'm not going to give because it's not under obligation. Maybe that guilt that you feel is like conviction from the Holy Spirit. But at the same time, like, don't feel like if you don't do this, like God's going to like hate you. I think that there's that, right? Ultimately, all of this is to help us form to be like Jesus, who was the example of generosity. He who was the most rich in the universe gave it all up for us. The lack of a clear rule in all of this, just to kind of sum it up, means that we have to be listening to the Spirit of God, listening to Jesus, and regularly coming before him in quiet and asking him, God, how do you want me to use this thing? This is an invitation into a relationship, ultimately. The lack of clarity, I think, is an invitation to the relationship to ask this question, God, how do you want me to steward your things? How do you want me to steward your things? And keep asking yourself that question. How am I supposed to steward that new car that I got? How am I supposed to steward the house that you gave me? How am I supposed to steward that pay raise you gave me? How am I supposed to steward X, Y, and Z? And you come to reflect, God, thank you for the things and the gifts that you've given me. How can I use those to bless them? What are the resources that you've given me to use? Sometimes I think it's easy to forget the things that we already have, right? And so this should lead us into a deeper relationship with God. And I think that this is I think many of us don't listen to God around these things because we're scared of what he might say. I was there. Because this is the truth. We believe the myth that more money equals more happiness, and we're scared that God might ask us to give it away. And that the truth is that we will not live as great a life. I think that's like the heart the heart point of it is that God's going to make our lives miserable. We don't believe that God is our Father or provider. Which is why I think in the same passage that we said in Luke 12, Jesus says this, do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. God is not a stingy investor who's out to just maximize his profit margins. He is ultimately our loving Father who wants to bless us and form us into his children, who is like Jesus, generous and joyful. And it should be an honor that we could steward whatever resources that we have for his glory. So the invitation that I have for you this week is to rethink your relationship with your things and your money. Not as an owner or a non-owner, but as a steward and a caretaker, and to begin kind of a lifelong journey on learning to listen and to the loving, generous voice of our Father, and to start giving back to him. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for coming, and Jesus, we thank you for preaching generosity and giving, and because I think that you sense in our hearts the things that prevent us from experiencing you and your world, and you want to free us from these things. And I pray that you would allow us to learn to see the world in a new way, to see our stuff in a new way, and that we can begin to practice of giving things back to you, not because that we are afraid of you, not because we feel like that if we don't do it that you'll dislike us, but ultimately so that we can experience the joy of your generosity in giving and to partner in that with you and to free us from the tyranny of our things. We ask all of these things in your name, Jesus, who lives and reigns in unity with the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen.